Far and away, the scariest part of the story is Jason's when he brings the Dybbuk box home and he goes to bed that first night and then the following night what he sees in his living room. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, at the next solar eclipse, offer the like button a pair of children's cardboard 3D glasses and tell them that they can look directly at the solar eclipse with these on. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In 2003, Kevin Mannis owned an antique shop right in downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge, which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop. And so one day there was this estate sale over at this woman's house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor and her estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by bundling them in different lots. So depending on what item it was, they'd be bundled with similar items and then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on the whole lot. They couldn't buy individual items. And Kevin had his eye on one particular lot called Lot 29, and Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that he wanted to sell in his shop, and it had this mystery box, and that's exactly as it was labeled. It just says mystery box on it, and he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on Lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he was really happy about it. So he takes the contents of Lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car, and as he's loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin in his head went right back to his childhood, because growing up, he had always been scared of Dybbuks, because a Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit in Jewish folklore, and Kevin was Jewish, and so his parents used to say, "Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuks, and so his interest is piqued. And Kevin turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, "Yeah, and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it." And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide, and there are these little doors that swing open on the front, and then on the bottom there's a drawer that comes out, and there's one lock that sits across the 2 doors, and it's currently locked with a little padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes, "Why can't you open it?" And the woman just says, "We never knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk, and so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we stayed away from her Dybbuk box." Kevin agreed that was pretty weird, and he finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said bye to the woman, hopped in his car, and he drove away. And he never really gave it a second thought. At this point, he's not thinking the Dybbuk box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's just some random chest that he won at an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction. He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs, because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor, had lots of rows of shelving, and it had a workstation down there. He would bring his new things down there and he would price them and get them ready before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front 2 doors. He doesn't want to damage it, but he can tell this lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver and he basically wedges it underneath the actual metal clasps that are attached to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it off and pops it out of the wood. And as soon as he does that, the doors swing open and there's like a mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens at the same time. And Kevin remembered thinking how silly it was that this kind of old, crummy looking wine closet had this fairly complicated mechanism inside of it that still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s. There was a used candle. There were 2 locks of hair. There was this small tombstone that said Shalom on it. And there was also a small wine goblet that was inside, and that was it. And Kevin immediately thought, well, this is just some older woman's keepsake, and these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman, and Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that day, and it was before opening time. So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright, and it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were not perfectly aligned with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of knocking things over. And so a lot of times Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like 1 or 2 crappy working lights before they'd say, okay, we really got to go up there and replace some of these bulbs. And so as it happens, this day, they're down to like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops, and she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time, and she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space. So she doesn't know where she's getting this feeling from, but she really can't shake it. And as she's kind of looking around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was on a table right at the base of the stairs. The phone rings down there and it startles her. And then it kind of jumps her back into reality, and she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is lined up against the wall and then it falls over, the sound that the wooden stick would make as it hits concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey, let me call you back. She hangs up on her friend and she's looking out, and because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the stairs looking down all these rows, and she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side back where she had been originally. She's kind of looking around and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row, something smashes behind her, and she turns around, and one of the fluorescent tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and smashed onto the ground. And so all of a sudden she doesn't want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement. Instead, she's ready to leave. And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here. And as she's walking down one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves comes flying off of it and lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path. And there's no way this could have happened unless someone pushed this chair. And suddenly she thinks, someone's down here with me. And she screams and she hurdles the chair and she runs to the steps. She starts running up, and to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer to protect the store from thieves. And it was shut and locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key. So there's no way she would have done this by accident. And now she's freaking out because she's trapped in the basement with some person running around, pushing chairs over and breaking lights. And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it, and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking down into the basement, and she starts hearing more lights falling off the ceiling and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, While Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop, he's only a couple minutes away and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat, and he picks it up and it's Jane, and he answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical and she's screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things, and Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes, well, where are you? And she's like, I'm in the basement. And he was like, get out of the basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out. Kevin was only about a block away from his shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. When he's looking around, there's no damage to the first floor. There's no damage anywhere. And he yells for Jane. There's no answer from Jane. And he starts walking kind of tentatively through the store towards the back. And he gets to that door leading down into the basement, the same one that Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore. And he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door? But Jane's not on the first floor, and their first floor is very small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is. And she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves, and there's glass all over the ground. And he's looking at Jane, and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you got to tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me, and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now, at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was going to have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff. But as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's going to take a flashlight and he's going to explore the basement because either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around, and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here, and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane, and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible about this now, but at the time, he's thinking to himself, you know, this had to have been Jane. Who else would have done this? I don't know why she did this, but there's no one else here. And he goes, Jane, did you do this? And this is when Jane's emotions came through, because before she was in shock, now she's mad. And she goes, F you, Kevin. And she leaves. And she doesn't say another word to him, and she doesn't come back. She quits on the spot. But at the time, Kevin believed she had done it. So he was kind of like, oh well. He was not even a little bit thinking the Dybbuk box had anything to do with this. Just a couple of days after the basement incident, Kevin's mother was supposed to come by the antique shop, and the two of them were going to leave and get lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin goes, hey mom, I got a gift for you. And he brings over this wrapped box and he sets it down on a table right in front of his mother, who's sitting on a chair. And he unwraps it, and it's the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin can explain what it is, the phone rings at the other end of the store, and he was expecting a call, and he goes, hold on mom, I gotta get this. And he goes to the back of the store to answer the call while his mom is just sitting there looking at the box. And so while Kevin is at the other end of the store, his mother opens the Dybbuk box, and she says she had to sit down as soon as she opened it because she had this unbelievable, overwhelming sense of dread as soon as the doors were open. And she's staring at it like she can't take her eyes away, and then all of a sudden she has a massive stroke. And so she keels over and she can't move and she can't talk. And Kevin sees this happening. He runs over and he's like, Mom, what's going on? He calls 911. And as the paramedics are working on her, she would say that while she was in this kind of paralyzed state, when she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, All she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself, because her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in a hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, that he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking and she was looking at the Dybbuk box like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement and now my mom's had a stroke. So I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved. He's like, thank goodness that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open and then the door shut. And he walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box. And there's writing on it. And all it says is, this has an odd darkness about it. This really freaked Kevin out because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store. So he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and he locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream. Where in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend, and he trusts this person, and the area he's in feels very friendly, and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him, and he can't move anymore, and he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his, and they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again, and he can't move. He's anchored to the spot, and as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist, and her head is down, and he can't tell what she's doing, and she's pretty far away, and she's walking closer and closer to him, and when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up, and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse, and she raises her hands up in front of her, then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water, and as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily. He's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream. And he goes back into the bathroom and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck. And now in his mind, he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real. And so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home, so he receives the package, he eagerly brings it into the kitchen, he unpackages it, and he sets it on the kitchen table, and just a few minutes later, Brian comes home, and Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere, and he's walking around thinking, what happened? This smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell, and there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful looking chest, which was of course the Dybbuk box, and he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen, and Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw, where people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. All of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. That now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they'd replace the light bulb, and then sure enough it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping, and so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge, and they would all kind of like converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over it, and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep. And so he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. And so finally, no matter how cool their blog was, it became too much, and they decide we have to get rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it gets sold to a guy named Jason, who is this museum director over at this other university in Missouri, and he had actually been following along with Sam's blog. He was very interested in what was going on with the Dybbuk box, and when it was listed for sale, he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk box, and Jason receives it in the middle of a workday, so he puts the package in his truck and he goes upstairs and he works for the day, and then afterwards, when everyone's left the office, he goes downstairs, gets the package, brings it back up to his office, puts it on his desk, and he cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the museum that he was the director of. And so Jason starts by taking a whole bunch of pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box, and then he gets his black light out and he begins scanning around the outside, and he finds all these traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box and he pops off the lock and he gets ready. And he opens the doors and the drawer slides out with that whole mechanical device. It all kind of comes open and Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him thought, like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it up, the haunting's going to begin. And nothing happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the locks of hair, he's just kind of let down by it, and he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax. There's nothing going on here. It's just a random old chest. And so he closes it up and he puts it on another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but was just kind of another table inside of this office that he shared with some other people. And he figured it would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of like a showpiece. So the next day, his colleagues come in and he explains what a Dybbuk box is and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted, and it makes people sick and gives people strokes, and there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing. And his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool. But they don't think much of it until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start crashing and their IT department comes up and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to replace the light bulbs as they went out. Something they never had to do before, but all of a sudden the Dybbuk box is in the room and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's coworkers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick and they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine until that thing came in here. Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that day after work, Jason goes and takes the Dybbuk box, puts it in the back of his truck, and his truck had a cover on the back. So he secures it in the back, he drives home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside because it just seemed weird to bring a cursed object inside that his coworkers just made him get out of their space because it was making them sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the house. And you walk forward about 5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. If you walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the hall another 5 or 6 feet, you come to the master suite where Jason and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that door, there is a wall on your left where there's a big bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. Even though they have a shade up, it's this orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, so he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the closest into the room. So that night, Jason goes to bed and he falls asleep. But just a couple hours later, he wakes up suddenly and he can't move his body. He can only move his eyes. He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds. Slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door is open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. And this is all out of the corner of his eye. And because of the orange hue coming in from the window, he can definitely tell that there is a real solid figure right there. This is not in his imagination, it's right there. And this woman begins shuffling her way across the foot of the bed, and right at the foot of the bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns and looks directly at him. And then she runs around the corner and she looks down at him and she takes her fingers and she drives them into his eyes. And Jason thinks it's real and he's screaming in pain, and he wakes up and his wife is grabbing him and she's like, Jason, what's wrong? And he's like, what's going on? And she says, honey, it's just a bad dream. You're fine. And he's shaken up, his heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's trying to think, like, that felt really real. And he's like feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so eventually he goes back to sleep. And then the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes, and they're all red around the outside and the whites of his eyes are covered in blood. His eyes look horrible, like he's having this terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it looks. And his wife comes in and she's like, what happened to you? And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed, because the two previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that horrible, vivid dreams, just like the one he had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of a Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck covered up in his driveway. And so Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his family, and then he's sitting down in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason hears his son say, hey Dad, who is that? And he looks over at his son, and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around, and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, you just saw that too? And he's like, yeah, who was that? And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, we have to leave the house right now. His wife comes downstairs and she's like, what's going on? And he was like, I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car. And so his wife sees how serious Jason is, and she says, okay. And they get into her car and they drive down the road. And that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red, and his wife's starting to get really scared, and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back. It's still locked in the back of the truck. And he's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that no one was staying in. And he was going to put it in the basement. And it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it. Because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well. And that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door, and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself, and he says, hey, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it. And the woman reacted, and she's like, I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family, and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it. And Kevin's like, actually, yeah, I did open it. And he described all the horrible things that happened, and he described selling it and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues, and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues, and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it. And that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would just They would do this for fun. And Havilah had made this Ouija board where she had stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around the pendant, and it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was. And Sophie said nothing ever happened. It was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. But one time it did work, and they said the chain would go rigid, and it would point over and over, and it would spell the words, "Release me, release me, release me." Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at first, but then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, it would find a way to attach itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they devised this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box, and that Dybbuk box is the same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie that, "What do? We've already opened it up." And she said, "You need to contact a rabbi." And so they would call a rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where it's been since 2003. And apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason and Kevin have said they've experienced no demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to have even the opportunity to reopen the Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell us in the comments section and tell us where you found it. So what's the timestamp? And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, at the next solar eclipse, please give the like button a pair of cardboard flimsy children's 3D glasses and tell them with these on, you can look directly at the solar eclipse and be totally safe. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It is linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. My wife is a total skeptic. She does not believe in the paranormal whatsoever and never has. But when I told her just a portion of today's story, specifically the part about the passenger in first class, you'll know when you get to that scene, she told me she was so intrigued by it. And I think the reason for that is in this story, as you'll see, there were so many witnesses, hundreds of witnesses. And so how could they all be making this up? But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come over your house for a Ouija board session, and then after everyone has their fingers on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the like button, and then casually push the pointer towards no. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29, 1972, passengers inside of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, which included the 13 crew members, had made it on board, and then at that point, the 13 crew members began making their final preparations for takeoff. Flight 401 was a very expensive and recently introduced model of plane by Eastern Airlines called the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, and it was both unbelievably technologically advanced and unbelievably enormous. It sat up to 400 passengers, which meant instead of having 4 seats to a row like you would expect inside of a passenger jet, the L-1011s had 8 seats per row And they had two levels. There was the main level, which was the main cabin where all the passengers were, and then there was a second level, a lower level, that was only accessible via two small elevators that could barely fit one person inside of them in the back of the aircraft. And down on this lower level was a full-size kitchen, which had ovens and refrigerators, and also at the back of this lower level was a lounge area for flight staff. The pilot that night was Bob Loft, who was a strikingly handsome 55-year-old man with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, which for reference is a ton of flying experience. Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist who exuded confidence and who was cool under pressure. After Bob had boarded the aircraft, he had made his way right into the cockpit, which is the very front of the plane where the pilots fly the plane, and he had sat down in the customary captain's seat, which was the front left seat. And then after he had sat down, his 10 years younger first officer or co-pilot, a man named Bert Stockstill, had joined him in the cockpit and sat down in the customary co-pilot seat, which was directly to the right of Captain Bob. And so after the pilot and co-pilot were both seated, the remaining two members of that night's cockpit crew came into the cockpit. Now, normally in most passenger jets, there were only two seats in the cockpit, but because L-1011 planes were so massive, there were four seats in the cockpit. And so one of the last two men who joined the cockpit was 51-year-old Don Repo, who was the flight's engineer. And despite him being this big, strong ox of a man, he was actually known as being fairly soft-spoken and very approachable. And so Don came into the cockpit, he said hello, and then he sat down in the seat right behind the co-pilot, Bert. And then a few seconds after Don, the last man came into the cockpit. It was 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo. Angelo was not actually part of that night's flight crew. However, he was an employee of Eastern Airlines, and that night he needed to get to Miami, and so the company had put him on Flight 401 and sat him in the fourth and final seat in the cockpit right behind Captain Bob. Around 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks had been completed, all passengers were seated, as was the crew, and so Captain Bob began taxiing over to the runway. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward and the plane began to take off. A few minutes later, and Flight 401 was airborne up in the night sky over New York, headed south towards Miami. For the next 2 hours, this flight was completely normal. In fact, it was so normal that one of the passengers, named Jerry Escow, actually wrote a letter while he was on the plane telling Eastern Airlines how great their airline was and how smooth this flight was. His plan was, once they landed, to mail this letter to Eastern Airlines. But at 11:32 p.m., so 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this flight would go from being very routine and normal to being anything but. At 11:32 p.m., Captain Bob began his approach to Miami International Airport, but when he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed they had a problem. L-1011 jets, like 401, have three pieces of landing gear. They have wheels that come down under the left wing, they have wheels that come down under the right wing, and they have wheels that pop out of the nose of the plane. And each of these pieces of landing gear has a corresponding little light bulb, a green light bulb, inside the cockpit that once that piece of landing gear comes down and locks in place and is ready to be landed on, its green light will go on inside of the cockpit. But when Captain Bob lowered their landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed only two of the lights came on. The one that did not light up was the nose landing gear. Now, Captain Bob and the other men in the cockpit, when they saw this issue, they immediately assumed it had to be the light bulb itself that was faulty, not the actual nose landing gear, because this plane was brand new, it had been checked before they left, so the likelihood of the nose landing gear being faulty was incredibly slim. And so Captain Bob, while maintaining his approach towards Miami International, he retracted the landing gear, and then once it had come back into the plane, he just lowered it again, thinking this time all three lights would come on. But once again, once the landing gear was deployed the second time, still the nose landing gear light did not come on. And so frustrated, Captain Bob hopped on the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control and told them that he could not confirm his landing gear was actually safe to land on, and so they would have to circle around for a bit in the sky and get it figured out. And so Miami Air Traffic Control acknowledged what Captain Bob said and then directed Captain Bob to fly out over the nearby Everglades, which is a massive wetlands area in Florida, and to stay out over the Everglades away from other traffic until they fixed the problem. And so once Flight 401 was out over the Everglades flying in a circular pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot so that it would maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a constant speed of 200 miles per hour. And so once the plane was all set, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert began fiddling with this front nose gear indicator light bulb, which they were convinced was faulty. And so they started by pressing on the light, and when that didn't work, they began twisting it, and when that didn't work, they actually pulled the light bulb off the panel and kind of blew the dirt and grime off of it, and then they jammed it back into the panel. But as soon as they did, not only did it not go back on, but they realized they had put it in sideways, and so they couldn't actually get it out again. And so now they're thinking, this light's not going to go on at all. We need to find another way to make sure the nose landing gear has come down. And so Captain Bob at this point is totally frustrated, and so he turns around and he looks at Don Repo, the flight engineer who's sitting right behind the co-pilot, and he tells Don to go down into the hellhole and directly inspect the front landing gear himself. So the hellhole is a space right below the cockpit, and the way you get to it is through a trap door in the floor in the center of the cockpit. And then once down in the hellhole, there is this window that looks straight towards the front of the aircraft where you could look out and actually see the front landing gear, and you could make sure it was down or not. And so Don Repo, he gets out of his seat and he opens up the hellhole trap door and he makes his way down below. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below Flight 401, a 43-year-old man named Robert Marquise, along with a friend of his, were looking for frogs in the Everglades, riding around on Robert's airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottomed boat with this huge fan on the back of it that propels it forward. It's popular in the Everglades because the water depth is so shallow. At points in the Everglades, the water's only a couple of inches deep. And so all around these two guys, it is totally pitch black out. There are no buildings or people for miles and miles and miles. Their only light source is Robert's headlamp. And so at some point, Robert turns off the airboat, and he and his friend are just standing in the middle of it, kind of scanning around on either side. And all around them, they can hear the sound of alligators growling and snakes and frogs moving about the tall grass. And as they're just kind of silently looking around them, out of the corner of Robert's eye, he sees something. And so he looks up right as he sees this huge orange and yellow flash that kind of came out of the ground roughly 5 miles away from where they were. And basically, as soon as Robert saw it, this flash dissipated and it was just totally gone. And so he turned to his friend who had not seen this flash, and Robert said, "Hey, let's go investigate. Let's see what that was." And so Robert fired up his boat again and he began flying across the Everglades straight in the direction of where he saw this flash. And after 15 minutes of cruising at 40 miles per hour across this dark expanse, they reached the area where this flash had been, and Robert and his friend, they just could not believe what they were looking at. About 20 minutes earlier, back up inside of Flight 401, when Captain Bob turned around in his seat to tell the flight engineer, Don Repo, to go down into the hellhole, it's believed that Captain Bob nudged the steering wheel with his leg. And this little nudge was enough to disengage the plane's autopilot, which sent the plane into a gradual descent. But nobody noticed. Because, one, it was totally pitch black outside, the Everglades below them, there's no lights, there's nothing, and there was no moon that night, and so when they're looking out the window, there would have been no visual cues that they were going down, up, or anything. It just would have looked like a total void outside. And two, the descent they were now suddenly in was so gradual, it would not have felt like they were tumbling out of the sky. It would have felt like they were just cruising as expected. And three, all of the men in the cockpit were completely fixated on this light bulb problem. In fact, they were so fixated that when an alarm went off inside of the cockpit telling them they had dipped below their intended altitude of 2,000 feet, they were now going down, nobody noticed. Although, to their credit, this alarm only sounded once and it wasn't that loud. And so not long after Don Repo had gone down into the hellhole, the plane crashed into the Everglades. No one on board Flight 401, from the cockpit crew to the passengers to the other flight staff, had any idea they were in an emergency until they hit the ground. And when they hit the ground, the plane exploded, and that was what Robert Marquis saw when he looked up and saw that yellow and orange flash. And so Robert and his friend, they speed over to the crash site, and when they get there, they are the first ones there. And even though they're looking out and they can hear the sound of all these people screaming and crying and moaning, they can't see anything because the fire from this huge explosion was already out, because the swampy wetlands had pretty much immediately extinguished it. And even though the plane had crashed into the ground at over 200 miles per hour, it had not struck the ground at a very steep angle, because basically the plane was in this gradual descent pattern and just kind of coasted until it hit the ground. And so that, combined with the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades, meant that the impact of the plane hitting the ground was not nearly as violent as other plane crashes were, and that ultimately saved lives. In fact, dozens of passengers survived the initial impact with the ground, but many of them were left with these horrible injuries, or they were trapped within the wreckage, or both. When Robert and his friend arrived at the edge of the crash scene, Robert lifted up his headlamp and began to scan, and he saw all these body parts sticking out of the ground, and then his light rested on the first survivor he saw, and it was this man whose clothes had been completely burned off from the explosion. All he had on was just a little bit of his socks on both ankles, and this man was still strapped into the seat that he had been on the plane, and when the plane had broken up, his seat had fallen forward into the mud, pinning this man's upper body and most of his face under several inches of water. And so as Robert had scanned over with his light had hit this man's face, and he had looked up and pleaded with Robert and his friend to come get him before he drowned. And so Robert and his friend, they jumped off their boat and ran over to this guy and pulled the chair up and out of the water, saving this guy's life. But as soon as he was up and out of the water, Robert and his friend began hearing more calls from other people in the darkness screaming for help. Robert and his friend would do their absolute best to save as many people as they possibly could, but there was just too many people who needed saving and not enough time. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the scene, the Coast Guard showed up in helicopters, and they, along with Robert and his friend, would spend the entire night pulling as many people to safety as they possibly could. By the time the sun came up on the following day, there were no other survivors left to save. All told, 99 people perished and 77 survived. Amongst the dead were Captain Bob Loft and his co-pilot Bert Stockstill and their flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole. Amongst these survivors was Angelo Donadeo, the fourth man in the cockpit, as well as Jerry Ascow, the man who ironically had written that letter to Eastern Airlines saying how wonderful that flight had been. A major investigation following the crash would confirm that the reason Flight 401 went down was because of a number of factors, most notably human error. The investigation would also confirm that the nose landing gear was working perfectly fine. The light bulb not coming on was a result of the light bulb being burned out. Following the investigation, Eastern Airlines would make every effort to compensate both the survivors of the crash and also families of those who were killed in the crash. Eastern Airlines would also make major changes to their training for their pilots and co-pilots and anybody that was ever going to be in the cockpit to ensure this type of disaster never happened again. But this was not the end of the story for Flight 401. I was recently eating lunch with a friend of mine in Uskapog, Rhode Island, when he asked me, "John, what is your biggest dream in life?" Now, ever since I was a literal newborn baby, I've had a huge dream, but I've always been too scared to commit to it. But for some reason, when my friend in Uskapog asked me this question, I felt this euphoria growing inside of me, and then before I could stop myself, I blurted out the truth. I want to create a mildly effective
I want to make a mildly effective cold medicine made exclusively out of Egyptian fire ants. And then before my friend could react to this revelation, I turned and leapt headfirst out the glass window. And then when I hit the ground, I turned around expecting to see my friend angry and staring down at me, ready to fight me. But instead, he was standing on our table doing a jig, stomping on our plates and our cups, and all around him, our waiters and waitresses were cheering, saying, "Go, John, go!" And so go I did. After a quick salute to the gang, I turned and I ran directly into traffic. And for 97 miles, I ran along the freeway until I got to Chicopee, Massachusetts, where I climbed up into a tree and I fired up my coal-powered laptop and I got to work on my business plan. But pretty quickly, I learned putting together a mildly effective cold medicine made exclusively out of Egyptian fire ants was going to be very time-consuming. And so where would I find the time to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh, an amazing meal service that sends incredible food right to your doorstep. So if your schedule is packed this fall with school, with work, or with developing your own fire ant-related products, then let HelloFresh take care of your meals. They have a weekly selection of 30+ recipes and 70+ convenience items, including vegetarian, pescatarian, and fit and wholesome meals, which make it easy to stick to your goals. HelloFresh is also up to 72% cheaper than dining out at a restaurant or going grocery shopping. So if you're like me and plan on spending the fall in adult diapers chained to a chair working non-stop on your coal-powered computer, or you're just regular busy, then give HelloFresh a try. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Again, that's HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Okay, back to the story. For almost 3 years after the crash, hundreds of Eastern Airline employees began to experience a terrifying phenomenon. Now, at first, many of these employees were going to their superiors and reporting what happened to them, but very early on, Eastern Airlines made it clear that they didn't want anybody to talk about this. Anytime an employee made one of these reports about this phenomenon, they were either sent to the psychiatrist or they were just fired. However, despite this intense pressure from Eastern Airlines to their employees to be quiet about what was going on inside of their ranks, there were still some very brave employees who had firsthand experience with this terrifying phenomenon who still came forward and told their stories to the press and to journalists. They just did it anonymously. And so I'm going to tell you 2 of the most chilling accounts from those employees. Keep in mind, the names used in these stories have all been changed. In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these 2 women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these 2 women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011, just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now, for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate thing to do. These parts were extremely expensive and they worked perfectly fine and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318, and after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight.
And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. And so at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began heading down to the second level, Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level to see if Denise needed any help. And so the two women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was. And they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So when you come down on either of those two elevators, when the doors open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very, very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other, and then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards. If you were to walk down the kitchen straight towards the front of the plane, you would eventually reach a wall that separated the kitchen to the lounge area, and there was a door slightly off to the right side on this wall that you could walk through to get into the lounge. So if you were standing in the kitchen and looking in the direction of this door, you wouldn't really be able to see into the lounge area because, again, the door was kind of off to the side. You would have to actually go over to the door and poke your head through to get a full unobstructed view of the lounge. And all the lounge was a couple of sofas and chairs kind of arranged in a circle. So Ginny has gotten back in the elevator and she's made her way back downstairs to continue looking for Denise. She gets down to the lower level, the doors open up, and she looks out into the kitchen, and Denise is not there. In fact, the kitchen is totally empty. And the door leading into the lounge area is shut, so she can't even see in part of the way into the lounge to see if anybody is in there. But the second Ginny stepped off the elevator into the kitchen, she immediately had this powerful sense that Denise was definitely down there somewhere on the second level with her, probably in the lounge area that she couldn't see. And because Ginny felt so confident that Denise was down there, she actually didn't start by calling out for Denise or walking to the door, opening it up, and looking into the lounge to make sure Denise was there. Instead, Ginny just turned to the left and went to the ovens and began preparing food for the attendants upstairs. And as she's making these plates of food, Ginny would periodically look over at the closed door leading into the lounge, kind of expecting it to open up at any point and see Denise walk out. But after a couple of minutes, no one had opened the door from the lounge, and Ginny was thinking to herself, I'm making quite a bit of noise over here. If anybody was down here, wouldn't they come out of the lounge and just see who it was? And because Ginny, again, had this really intense feeling that she was not alone down there, she began to think, wait a minute, is Denise playing a practical joke on me? Is she hiding in the lounge? Or is she hiding in one of the cabinets on the right side here, and she's going to jump out and grab me? And so the second Ginny began thinking about that, she became really paranoid. And so as she's making this food, she's pretty much constantly looking over at the door or kind of scanning behind her, waiting for Denise to launch out and scare her. But again, after several more minutes, Ginny didn't see anybody come out of the lounge and none of the cabinet doors opened up. It was just her down there. However, the longer she stayed down there, the stronger that feeling got that someone was in the room with her. And so now she can't even make her food. She's completely turned around, just scanning all around the kitchen, really at this point hoping Denise jumps out to scare her. And when Denise didn't do that, Ginny just began walking over to the door that would lead into the lounge. And so when she reached the door, her heart was racing like mad. She reached down to the handle, she turned it, she pushed it open, and she poked her head in real quick.
and there was no one in the lounge. But immediately, the second her head was in that room, that feeling that someone was down there with her spiked, and she got chills all over her body. And she ran into the back of the lounge and looked behind all of the chairs and sofas, praying at this point that Denise was going to be down there. But after looking all over the back of the lounge, there was no one there. And so finally, Ginny turns around and she's totally racked with fear, because now she's on the very far end of the lounge. There's no one in the lounge. She knows there's no one in the kitchen. And here she is still getting that sensation that she was not alone down there. But she has to go all the way back across the lounge through that door into the kitchen to get back to the elevator so she can escape. And so Ginny almost instinctively moved immediately to the left side of the lounge and put her back up against the wall to make sure no one could be behind her. And then she began slowly inching her way along the left wall towards the door that was now open that would lead back into the kitchen. And as she's slowly shimmying along, her view of the kitchen is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the whole time she's thinking, I'm going to see someone in the kitchen, because this sensation that someone is down here with me is not going away. But when she finally gets to the door and crosses into the kitchen, there's still no one there. And so she makes a run at that point to the elevator. She starts hitting the button. And as she's hitting the button, she's turning around and she has that awful feeling that someone's right behind her. And then finally the car comes down. She hops inside the elevator. She shuts the doors. She hits the button and she begins going back up. When the elevator cart got back to the main level and the doors opened again, Ginny almost knocked over the flight attendant that was standing right outside of it, a woman named Mildred. And after Mildred and Ginny kind of regained their balance, they both looked at each other, and Mildred could see very clearly that Ginny looked horrible. She was totally pale, she was sweating. And so Mildred said, Ginny, are you okay? What's going on? And Ginny would just say, I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on. I don't know. But Mildred, instead of asking follow-up questions, just said, Ginny, you need to come with me. And so Ginny would follow Mildred, who led them back around behind the elevators to the space in the back of the plane, kind of out of view of the passengers. And there, Ginny would find Denise. And Denise looked pale as a ghost. She was sweating and looked totally shaken up. It would turn out when Ginny left the lower level for the first time to come up to the main level to look for Denise, and then learned that Denise was not up there, that Denise had actually gone down to look for Ginny. In those few minutes that Ginny was up on the main level before she went back down again to continue looking for Denise, Denise was on the lower level. And Denise would say when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, there was no one down there, but immediately she believed Ginny had to be down there because of the strong sense that she was not alone down there. However, when she opened up the door to look into the lounge, she didn't see anyone, and it totally spooked her. She shut the door, she ran back to the elevators, and she went back upstairs. And as she was going up in her elevator car, who, once again, passed her in the other elevator car? Ginny. And so once again, the two women did not see each other. And so these two women, who had never experienced anything like this before in their lives, had nearly identical experiences, totally independent of each other, just a couple of minutes apart in the exact same space. It was just too many coincidences for them to totally write it off. And so that was a big reason why they felt like they had to come forward with their information. One month later, plane number 318, the same plane that Ginny and Denise had had their frightening experiences on, was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, undergoing pre-flight checks from its crew before its flight to Miami that morning. After most of the checks were done, the passengers were allowed to board the plane, and then after it seemed like most of the passengers had arrived and taken their seats, the senior flight attendant, whose name was Sis, began counting the people on board the plane to make sure they had everyone. And after counting up and down the rows, she realized their head count was off by one. They had one too many people. And so when Sis began recounting, she actually quickly identified the discrepancy. Sis was standing in first class in the aisle, and as she was counting down the left side of first class passengers, she noticed there was an Eastern Airlines captain seated in one of the seats. And so immediately Sis thought, oh, okay, I don't recognize this person, but since he's in uniform, he must be deadheading.
Deadheading is a fairly common practice for airline employees where if they need to be on a particular flight but are not physically at the origin airport, they will just hop on another company flight that happens to be going to the airport they need to go to. And at least in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for employees not necessarily to tell the flight staff until they were literally on the plane, because these employees would just check the manifest, see if there were openings, and then climb on board. And so Sis assumed that was exactly what this man had done, and that was why he was unaccounted for, and it was why they had this extra person. And so she just needed to get his name to account for him. And so Sis turned and took a couple of steps until she was right in front of this guy who was still just seated looking straight ahead, and Sis introduced herself and asked him if he was deadheading. But the captain just continued to stare straight ahead and didn't even seem to register that Sis was talking to him, despite the fact that Sis was right on top of him and speaking very, very clearly, and nobody else was talking. And so Sis, who was aware of the fact that this guy clearly should have heard her, just kind of waited for a second and then just asked again, hey, what's your name? I need to make sure that you are in fact deadheading. But again, this captain just sat there without moving and didn't remotely react to Sis. Now, by this point, another flight attendant named Diane had looked over and actually saw Sis having this strange interaction with this Eastern Airlines captain. And so Diane walked over and listened as Sis, for a third time, tried to get this guy's attention, but he still did nothing. And so Diane and Sis, they start looking at each other like, what do we do about this? And at some point, Sis just says, okay, I'm going to go tell the captain, he can deal with this. And so Diane stayed in the aisle next to this silent seated captain while Sis turned and walked towards the cockpit, and she told the captain, whose name was George. And so George, he leaves the cockpit with Sis by his side, and they start walking down the aisle back towards where this guy was and where Diane was. And by the time they get there, 6 other passengers kind of in the general vicinity had noticed something strange was going on. And so they were all kind of turned around in their seats, looking at this captain who was sitting there, and Diane and Sis and George kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. And so George and Sis, they walk right up alongside Diane and this seated silent captain, and George immediately crouched down to get a good look at this guy's face, because again, this captain is just looking straight ahead with a hat on, and so no one had really looked at him yet. And so George kneels down and he sees this guy's face for the first time, and he falls over and goes, oh my God, that's Bob Loft! The same Bob Loft who had died on Flight 401, the captain of Flight 401. George had known Bob really well and knew exactly what Bob looked like. But before Bob, Sis, Diane, or the 6 other passengers that were all watching could do anything, the seated, silent captain that looked exactly like Bob Loft vanished into thin air right in front of all of them. And immediately, these 6 passengers on board the flight that saw this happen became hysterical. They could not understand what they had just seen. People are screaming and crying, and George, Diane, and Sis, they were very shaken at what they saw, but they knew they were in charge of this flight. And so they tried to calm down the passengers, but then very quickly, they organized a search of the plane, because they're telling themselves, no one can just disappear into thin air. This guy has to be somewhere on the plane. And so for over an hour, the passengers were told to stay in their seats and were told to stay calm while the flight crew searched every crevice, every nook and cranny of this flight to see if they could find this guy. But they never did. And so after a very long delay, plane number 318, along with its very shaken up passengers and flight crew, eventually rumbled out onto the runway and took off. When they landed in Miami, the first thing George, Diane, and Sis all did is they went in and filed a report about what they had seen, about this vanishing person. But Eastern Airline didn't do anything about their reports. In fact, the logbook where these reports were kept was conspicuously missing a couple of weeks later when some other employees of the airline heard about this vanishing person and wanted to read the reports themselves. And when these employees went to their superiors and asked if they could get this logbook, the answer from the top was George, Diane, and Sis never filed those reports. There was no vanishing person. This whole thing is a bunch of crap.
But George, Diane, and Sis all said, we filed those reports, and apparently some other pilots within Eastern Airlines had actually seen the reports before the logbook went missing, and they would tell other people that what they read was terrifying. Over the next 2 years, there would be an astounding number of other totally unexplainable events that took place on other planes within Eastern Airlines' fleet. However, the strange events only occurred on L-1011 jets that had parts on them from the crashed Flight 401. Some of these unexplained events included more sightings of the silent seated captain who looked just like Bob Loft. And in fact, one of those sightings was by an Eastern Airlines executive who, after seeing this captain vanish into thin air right in front of him, the executive freaked out and ran off the plane and demanded the plane be searched top to bottom. But like the last search, nothing was found. On another occasion, the catering company that loaded food directly into the second level of these L-1011s, basically right into the kitchen, one of their staff spotted a man wandering around the lower level that looked just like Don Repo, the flight engineer from the doomed Flight 401. And when this staff member spoke to this man who looked like Don Repo turned towards him and then vanished into thin air. The catering company was so scared when this happened that they refused to go back into the plane, and it caused a massive delay. On another flight, on board plane number 318, the pilot and co-pilot began hearing banging coming from the hellhole, and when the pilot got up and opened up the hellhole and went down below and shined his light, he didn't see anything, but when he went to climb back up into the cockpit, he looked up, and standing in the cockpit was once again Don Repo looking straight down at him, who then promptly vanished right in front of him. On another flight, a female passenger in coach, who had been quiet the entire flight, suddenly began screaming hysterically. And when they went up to her and asked her what was wrong, she was pointing at the seat next to her and said a man had suddenly appeared right next to her. He did not walk in, he just appeared next to her, and then when she began screaming, he vanished right in front of her. This woman was so upset that when they landed finally in Phoenix, Arizona, she had to be restrained in a straitjacket when they pulled her off the plane. But as terrifying as all of these events were, there was at least one instance where these apparitions appeared to be helpful to the people on the plane. One captain said he walked into the cockpit, and standing in there was flight engineer Don Repo, and Don promptly told the captain about a specific malfunction in one of the engines before Don vanished in front of this captain. Now, this captain was horrified at what he had just seen, but he did actually go down and have that engine looked at, and sure enough, the malfunction that Don Repo said it had. Then finally, in 1974, all of these strange events just came to an abrupt stop. Now, no one knows exactly why, but in 1974, Eastern Airlines, despite telling the world they didn't believe any of the reports of these strange happenings on their planes, despite that year, they went into every single one of their L-1011 jets, and they removed any parts that had been placed on them from the crashed Flight 401, despite the fact none of those parts were faulty. They were removing perfectly good parts, and they never gave a reason. And after they did that, all the sightings just stopped. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come over for a Ouija board session. And once everyone has their fingertips on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the like button and then subtly push the pointer towards no. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new episodes that are exclusive to the podcast on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we put out remastered audio from our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is called MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to rewrite the ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Both of those channels are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. This video is brought to you by HelloFresh. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the like button's place of work 1 minute before closing time, and then proceed to browse around for about 30 minutes, and then leave without buying anything. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. And 31-year-old Larry Bader was living with his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in Akron, Ohio. Larry was a good father and good husband, but he was a terrible businessman. Over the past several years, he had launched several new business ventures, and they had all failed, throwing the family into fairly significant debt. And so even though Larry desperately wanted to be an entrepreneur and eventually start a quality business, they didn't have the money to do that. And so he had to just take some job in order to pay the bills. And so the job he got was a cookware salesman for a local company, and it did pay the bills, but it did not make Larry happy. And so on the weekends when Larry was not working, and if it was okay with his wife, he would basically just disappear and go fishing on Lake Erie, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And that was his way of kind of disconnecting from reality and kind of disconnecting from his somewhat crappy life. And so on Friday, March 15th, Larry approached his wife and said, hey, I'd like to head up to Lake Erie and go fishing for the weekend. And she would tell him, I got the kids, it's fine, you can go do that, but I heard the weather was going to be really bad. Are you sure that's such a good idea? And Larry would tell her, you know what, don't worry about it. These storms, they always hype them up. They're never a big deal. I'll be fine. And so he kissed his wife, he kissed his kids, he grabbed his stuff, he hopped in his truck, then he left and headed up to Lake Erie. That night, Lake Erie was hit with a massive thunderstorm, way bigger than the one that the news was predicting. And then the following morning, the Coast Guard discovered Larry's boat floating around on Lake Erie. There was minor damage to it, and it was missing an oar, and it was missing Larry. Larry was nowhere to be found. And so a search was launched for Larry, but he was never found, and he was eventually declared dead. And so even though the family did not have Larry's body, they would hold a funeral for him, and his wife was able to actually cash his life insurance policy, which was enough to pay for her and the kids. 8 years later, in 1965, Larry Bader's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Peka, was in Chicago at a sporting goods show with a friend of hers. And as they're walking through the different exhibits, looking at different sporting goods equipment, they noticed over on the side of the building, there was a fairly large group of people gathered around this one particular exhibit. And so she and her friend she was with walked over to this group, and they kind of pushed their way through. And in the middle of this group was this man with an eye patch and a big mustache doing an archery demonstration. Basically, he was shooting arrows into a target about 30 feet away. And so Suzanne and her friend just kind of watched this guy for a couple of minutes, and very quickly they could see why he was attracting this big crowd, because he was just an incredible archer. He was hitting the bullseye over and over and over again. But as they continued to watch this guy, Suzanne's friend started to notice something unique about him. And he eventually turned to Suzanne and said, "Hey, doesn't this guy look exactly like your uncle who went missing on Lake Erie?" And Suzanne was kind of surprised to hear him talking about her missing uncle, but she turned and looked at this guy, and all of a sudden she saw it too. He was a spitting image of Larry Bader, her uncle, although this guy had an eye patch and a mustache, but even with that, he looked exactly like Larry. And as Suzanne is watching him, she's thinking, Larry was known for being this incredible archer, and here this guy is who looks just like him, and he's an incredible archer. And so after this demonstration was over, Suzanne and the friend ran over to this guy with the eye patch on, and Suzanne says to him, "Hey, I know this sounds totally crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader, who went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." And so the guy, he hears her and he kind of smiles and says, "I'm sorry, I don't know Larry Bader. My name is John Johnson. People call me Fritz. I'm sorry, I don't know who your uncle is. I can't help you." But Suzanne, as she stood there staring at this guy, she was becoming more and more convinced this was Larry Bader, despite the fact this guy is saying he is not Larry Bader. And so she says to him, "No, you are Larry Bader. I'm positive you're my uncle." Now at this, Fritz would be polite but firm, and he would reiterate that, "Look, I'm not your uncle. I don't know who Larry Bader is. I don't go to Lake Erie. I just don't understand why you think I'm him. I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my wife and my kids, and I'm on TV. I do sports journalism in Omaha, and I advise archery companies, and that's why I'm here. So I don't know why you think I'm your uncle, but I'm not. I'm sorry." And with that, Fritz turned around and he walked away. And after this discussion, Suzanne and her friend were not remotely deterred from what Fritz was saying. They were completely convinced this was Larry Bader. And so they ran to a phone, and Suzanne called her two other uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, and she explained how she met this guy that is the spitting image of their brother. And they immediately hopped on a flight that night and flew to Chicago. And the following morning, the two uncles, along with Suzanne and her friend, they went back to the sporting goods show. They went over to the archery exhibit, and sure enough, there was Fritz doing his archery demonstration. And as soon as there was a break, Suzanne, her friend, and now the two uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, they walk over, and the two uncles, as soon as they see this guy, despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, they too would say, "This is our brother." And so they approached him and they said, "Look, I know you're saying you are not our brother. I don't know what's going on here, but you look exactly like our brother, and we have his military paperwork right here with fingerprints. Will you please just humor us and go to the police station with us and get fingerprinted? That way you can prove you really are not our brother. Please, we've been looking for our brother for a long time. This would be a huge favor to us." And so Fritz was annoyed. He didn't want to do it, but he's like, "Okay, fine. I'll go to the police station with you. I'll get my fingerprints taken, and we can put this behind us." And so that day they left the sporting goods show. They went to a police station, and Fritz had his fingerprints taken. And afterwards, the police would tell him, "You are Larry Bader." When Fritz heard this, he could not believe it. I mean, he literally did not believe he was Larry Bader. It wasn't like this revelation prompted new memories and suddenly he recalled it all. It was really the opposite. Fritz immediately is trying to rack his brain to figure out, like, is my whole life a lie? But there was nothing. All he had was a contiguous stretch of memories from when he was a very young child as Fritz Johnson all the way to the present. But we now know that the bulk of his memories
are all not real. He was never a child as Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader, and then became Fritz Johnson only 8 years earlier. The timeline of what happened to Larry Bader is rough at best, but as far as we understand it, Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska a couple of days or a couple of months after Larry Bader went missing on Lake Erie. And when Fritz showed up in Omaha, he just walked into a restaurant and asked for a job there, and he had provided documentation that showed he was in fact Fritz Johnson, and nobody thought anything of it. He was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, and over time, Fritz just kind of thread himself into the Omaha community. I mean, he got married, he had a child, he adopted another child, he left his job as a bartender at a restaurant and eventually got this amazing job as a sports TV broadcaster for their local channel. I mean, he was like a minor celebrity in Omaha. Everybody recognized, oh, there's Fritz Johnson, he's on TV, hey Fritz, how you doing? I mean, he had a full-blown life. But as soon as the news broke that he was not Fritz Johnson, he was Larry Bader, right away, the TV station he worked for fired him. His second wife left him because in reality, he actually was still legally married to his first wife. And so his marriage to his second wife was never actually real to begin with. And so she leaves him. And then also because Larry Bader was no longer dead, the insurance company that had paid out all that money to his first wife as part of his life insurance policy, they demanded that he repay them. And throughout all this drama of Fritz finding out he's Larry Bader, Fritz continued to say he was not Larry Bader, that this was all a big mistake. He just could not understand how this could have happened. None of it made sense. And so eventually a team of experts, doctors, psychologists, you name it, they came out to Omaha and they ran Fritz, aka Larry Bader, through a battery of tests over almost 2 weeks. And at the end of all their testing, they concluded that one, Fritz definitely is Larry Bader. So there's no debate there. He is Larry Bader. And two, he is almost certainly suffering from an extreme case of amnesia, which is memory loss. But the doctors and experts had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And of course, Fritz, he too had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And it's unlikely we'll ever get any more clarity on exactly what happened to Larry Bader / Fritz, because unfortunately, just 1 year after it was discovered Fritz was Larry Bader, Fritz would die. He had cancer in one of his eyes, and that was actually why he wore that eye patch, and the cancer had come back and it took his life. Today, his case is considered to be one of the most believable and baffling cases of amnesia on record. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back during the beginning of the pandemic, we were not able to get groceries or have food delivered to our house. And so before long, we were down to eating just the Diet Cheetos and pickled licorice. And as I was eating my 77th bag of Diet Cheetos, I thought to myself, is there anything better for me to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh. HelloFresh is like one of those things where as soon as you have it, you think to yourself, how could I have ever lived without this? They send you this neat little box full of meals, and there's all these incredible meals to choose from fairly intricate to very quick and easy. And so whatever your tastes are, they got it. But the catch is they are not made. You are the chef and you make the meals. And before you tell me that you're a bad chef, I'm a bad chef, and I'm able to whip these meals together no problem because all the ingredients are perfectly proportioned, which also means you don't waste any food, and the recipes are incredibly easy to follow. So the end product is home-cooked, fresh, delicious food every time. So if your New Year's resolution is to eat better or to just stop snarfing as many Diet Cheetos, then you really need to sign up for HelloFresh. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com, use the code MrBallen16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Umaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Umaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although
so it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by of this totally high stress, anxious waiting period. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform. So they're looking out over this ravine and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision. Her heart is racing. She's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge. He leapt over the railing and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group. And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. Welcome. We'd love to have you join our group. And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Ossett. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're going to admit it in front of this whole group. And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast, and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other, speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent, and they look at Michael, and then Michael kind of opens his eyes, and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, and then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him, and very quickly they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism, and so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted, and as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground, and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house, and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows, and outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor, and he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police show up, and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it, and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on, and eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. And so that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go to the like button's place of work 1 minute before closing time and then proceed to browse around for about 30 minutes and then leave without buying anything. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.